September 1942. The wind sweeping across Dowfield in Maine carried the smell of salt and oil, whispering over a brand new B-17F bomber glinting under a grey sky. 10 young airmen stood before it, eyes tracing the polished metal skin of their new home in the sky. Captain Robert K. Morgan, lean, confident, and just 24, ran his fingers along the fuselage where fresh paint gleamed. Serial number 41-24485. None of the men beside him knew that this aircraft and their names would one day echo through history. At that moment they were just another crew among hundreds being sent to war, untested, unproven, unaware of the trials ahead. The Army Air Forces had recently received the new Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress, a machine designed for endurance and punishment. On paper, it could carry 6,000 pounds of bombs across Europe and defend itself with 13 machine guns. In reality, survival was another matter. In 1942, the life expectancy of a bomber crewman was measured in missions, not months. 8 out of 10 wouldn't live to finish their tours. Morgan knew the odds, and he didn't share them with his men. Before crossing the Atlantic, he kept a promise to stop in Tennessee, in a city whose name would christen their aircraft. There, in Memphis, he honoured the woman waiting for him back home. Her name was Margaret Polk, his sweetheart, whose letters had sustained him through training. Morgan wanted to call the plane Little One, his private name for her. But after seeing a movie featuring a riverboat called the Memphis Belle, the new title felt right. The nickname rolled easily off the tongue, and soon Margaret's smiling face would be painted on the bomber's nose. Her likeness immortalised in colour and aluminum, the Memphis Belle was born. She crossed the Atlantic that fall, touching down first in Scotland, then moving south through England to a countryside airfield known as RAF Bassingbourn. The base would become the Belle's home for 7 relentless months. It looked peaceful, rolling green hills, hedgerows and small stone villages, but it was the edge of a storm. Across the Channel lay occupied Europe, the heart of Nazi industry, and every mission from that quiet field meant flying into the teeth of one of the most lethal defence systems in military history. The 91st Bomb Group was tasked with daylight precision raids, an untested concept born at the Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama. The theory was elegant. Tight formations of B-17s, flying high and straight, could strike factories, shipyards and railways with surgical accuracy. But in practice there was a problem. No long-range escort fighters existed yet. Once the short-range Spitfires and P-47 Thunderbolts turned back over the French coast, the bombers were alone. What awaited them was a gauntlet of flak and fighters that turned the skies into a slaughterhouse. November 7th, 1942, the Memphis Belle's first mission, target submarine pens at Brest, France. The crew climbed into their stations before dawn, breath visible in the cold. As engines roared to life, the airfield shook. 30 tons of steel rolled down the runway, rising slowly into the black sky. Hours later, as the coast of France appeared beneath them, they saw the flashes, the black puffs of German flak, bursts that filled the air with shrapnel and fire. Their training vanished in the chaos. The bombardier shouted corrections. The gunners yelled as enemy fighters streaked past. It was their baptism by fire, and by sheer luck they came home. The first mission was done. 24 remained. The Belle's crew soon fell into a rhythm of exhaustion and ritual. They woke before sunrise, briefed, ate in silence, and climbed into their stations. The missions came in rapid succession. Saint-Nazaire, Lorient, Wilhelmshaven, submarine pens, docks, rail yards. They flew through weather so cold that frost formed inside the cockpit, through flak so dense it seemed like you could walk on it. They learned the hard math of attrition. Every flight meant empty bunks the next morning. Morgan once said, "When you have breakfast with 10 men and dinner with 2, you start to wonder if you'll be next." The Memphis Belle absorbed punishment like a living creature. She came back from missions with holes punched through her wings, engines dead, and the tail shredded. On 5 separate occasions she landed on fewer than 4 working engines. Once she limped home with a stabilizer nearly gone, the metal rattling like bones. The fact that she returned at all defied probability. The men inside her began to feel that the plane itself wanted to survive, and as long as she did, maybe they would too. Early 1943 brought no mercy. The weather was worse. the defences heavier. The bomber crews were now striking deep into Germany, into targets like Hamm and Wilhelmshaven, and the Luftwaffe met them with fury. Swarms of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs tore through formations, firing head-on into the bombers' noses where armour was weakest. Flak fields waited near every city, black clouds timed to detonate at altitude. The B-17s flew straight through, because evasive manoeuvres ruined accuracy, and accuracy was doctrine. They held course while death bloomed around them. By the end of January 1943, Morgan's crew had survived 8 missions. That's when Hollywood arrived. Major William Wyler, an Academy Award-winning director famous for Mrs. Miniver and Wuthering Heights, had joined the Army Air Forces with a camera instead of a gun. His orders: capture the war from inside a bomber. Wyler had already chosen another aircraft to film, but that plane, along with its crew, was lost over Bremen. He needed a replacement, and he found one in Morgan and his men. The Memphis Belle had already developed a reputation: disciplined, lucky, and unbreakable. Wyler saw what others were beginning to whisper, that this crew might make it all the way. So he mounted cameras inside the bomber, in the nose, the tail, the radio compartment. He climbed aboard for missions himself, filming combat in colour at 25,000 feet. It was freezing, deafening, and lethal. One of his cinematographers was shot down and killed. Wyler himself suffered frostbite and partial hearing loss. But his footage, the faces of real airmen in real combat, would become part of history. By spring, the Memphis Belle's mission count climbed past 20. Each number painted on the fuselage was both an achievement and a memorial to others who hadn't returned. Across the 8th Air Force, losses remained staggering. The life expectancy of a new crew was still a handful of missions. Yet somehow, Morgan's team endured. They had become a symbol, not of invincibility, but of survival against reason itself. Spring 1943 brought with it no warmth, only new missions and new funerals. The Memphis Belle and her crew had become veterans by survival alone. They had memorized every sound the fortress could make: the whine of turbines, the vibration before takeoff, the metallic chatter of 50 caliber guns. Each morning the crews gathered for briefings under the low ceilings of drafty English huts, the air thick with cigarette smoke and fear. Maps spread across the wall showed red lines stretching over France and into the Reich. Some of the targets were familiar, others sounded like death sentences. The Belle's 22nd mission struck Wilhelmshaven. The 23rd went to Antwerp. Every time the flak tore into their formation, the men silently counted engines, checked instruments, prayed. Luck had protected them this far, but everyone knew luck had limits. The final threshold was 25 missions, the magic number that meant home. It was a bureaucratic promise, a morale trick, and for most crews, an illusion. Very few ever reached it. By May, the Belle was just 2 flights away. William Wyler was still filming, risking his life alongside the men he was documenting. He knew he was recording history, not the sanitized kind, but the raw, shaking, oxygen-starved truth of what courage looked like at 25,000 feet. His cameras caught every recoil of the guns, every flinch as flak burst around them. On May 15th, 1943, Morgan and his crew took off for their 24th mission, a strike on Wilhelmshaven once again. The bomber came home battered but alive, smoke trailing from one engine. They were one mission from immortality. 2 days later, May 17th, they flew their last combat run. Target: Lorient, France. Enemy territory below was already burning when the Belle crossed the coast. Flak began at 20,000 feet and followed them all the way in. Fighters slashed through their formation, cannon shells exploding in bursts of light, but the Belle kept her wings level. The bombs fell true. When they turned for home, the crew barely spoke. They knew what this meant. Over 25 missions, 148 hours and 50 minutes of combat. They had dropped more than 60 tons of bombs across France, Germany and Belgium. They had shot down 8 enemy aircraft, claimed 5 probables, and damaged at least a dozen more. They had faced storms, engine failures, and enough flak to shred steel. And yet every man had survived. Against every law of probability, the Memphis Belle had done it. When they landed back at Bassingbourn that afternoon, the airfield erupted. Ground crews cheered, commanders saluted, even the King of England took notice. On May 18th, 1943, the 10 Americans were presented before King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. The monarch congratulated each man personally, a rare honour in wartime Britain. For once, these exhausted airmen stood as something more than soldiers. They were proof that survival was possible. The Air Force needed heroes, and the Belle's crew fit perfectly. Within weeks, they were back in the United States, beginning a national tour that would turn them into living legends. Their new mission was not to bomb, but to inspire. The War Department turned their story into a rallying cry for the American people. From June to September 1943, the Memphis Belle flew across 31 cities, appearing at parades, bond rallies, and factories. Captain Morgan led the crew on stage while audiences roared. They signed autographs, gave speeches, and showed the bullet holes in the plane. Reporters called them the boys who beat the odds. Workers from Boeing and Douglas plants wept as they touched the aircraft they had built. It was propaganda, yes, but honest propaganda, the kind the country needed. Beneath the cheers, the strain was showing. Fame was never what they wanted. Co-pilot James Verinis, who had already completed his own 25 missions and another bomber, found himself permanently labelled as Morgan's co-pilot. The press needed a single hero, and Morgan became that figurehead. The others accepted it quietly, but the reality was more complicated. They had all carried each other through hell. During the tour, Morgan's relationship with Margaret Polk, the real Belle, also began to fade. War, distance, and sudden celebrity created a rift that couldn't be bridged. The romance that had christened the bomber ended quietly before the tour was even over. By the time the Memphis Belle was reassigned to stateside duty, their lives had changed forever. After the tour, the famous bomber was transferred to MacDill Field, Florida, where it became a training aircraft. The same plane that had survived German fighters and flak now trained new crews heading into the storm. It seemed a fitting fate, the warrior teaching the next generation. For the remainder of the war, she stayed in the United States, her engines roaring over the Florida skies, carrying recruits who dreamed of surviving like her crew had. When victory finally came in 1945, the Memphis Belle was grounded. She was flown to Altus Army Airfield in Oklahoma and left in open storage, one among thousands of bombers suddenly without purpose. The war had ended, and America no longer needed its Steel Angels. By 1946, the aircraft was scheduled for disposal, scrap metal for peacetime industry. Her aluminum skin, once struck by flak over Germany, would have been melted down into cookware or car parts, but fate intervened. The mayor of Memphis, Walter Chandler, refused to let her die. For $350, less than the cost of a single mission's fuel, the city of Memphis purchased the bomber outright. She was flown home to the city that had given her a name. At first, she was stored. Then, in 1949, the Memphis Belle was placed outside the National Guard Armory near the fairgrounds, open to the sun, the rain, and the years. It was meant as a tribute, but time is cruel to heroes. By the 1970s, the once proud flying fortress had become a relic of corrosion and vandalism. Her paint flaked, her wings pitted, her fuselage carved with graffiti. The aircraft that had outlasted German fire was now dying slowly in peacetime. Veterans who had once flown beside her were horrified. It took decades and a coalition of dreamers to save her again. By the early 1980s, the Memphis Belle sat alone, decaying beneath the Tennessee sun. Her skin was blistered with rust. Her nose art faded to ghostly outlines. Her once proud tail number barely legible. Vandals had carved initials into her wings. Storms had ripped holes through her fuselage. The bomber that had carried 10 men through hell now faced a quieter, more merciless enemy: neglect. For a generation that had grown up after the war, she was just an old airplane behind a chain-link fence. But to those who remembered, she was a sacred relic, and one man refused to let her die. Frank D'Onofrio, a Memphis businessman and veteran, launched a campaign to save her. He wrote letters, raised funds, and pleaded with officials. Finally, in the mid-1980s, the city agreed to move the aircraft to a safer place. Federal Express and Boeing each donated $100,000. The city added more, and the American public, moved by a television feature about the plane's condition, raised the rest. On May 17, 1987, exactly 44 years after her final combat mission, the Memphis Belle was reborn. The restored aircraft was unveiled in a pavilion on Mud Island overlooking the Mississippi River. Nearly 25,000 people attended. 7 surviving B-17s flew overhead in salute, releasing rose petals that drifted down like red snow. Margaret Polk was there too, older now but still radiant, the living muse of the bomber's name. As the crowd roared, she stood quietly, tears in her eyes, watching the plane that had carried her image into legend. It was a moment of triumph, but even triumph can be temporary. The open-air pavilion, though well-meaning, could not protect the aircraft from weather and humidity. Within a few years, corrosion returned. Paint bubbled, metal cracked, and water seeped through seams. The city lacked funds for proper maintenance. Once again, the Memphis Belle was slowly dying. Then came another chance at salvation. In 2004, the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson in Ohio offered to take custody of the aircraft. It was the only institution with the expertise and resources to restore her properly. After decades of public display, the Belle was dismantled and transported north, trucked in pieces, her wings, tail, and fuselage separated, each section corroded but still intact. When the crates arrived in Dayton in October 2005, restorers found her riddled with scars, bullet holes, rust, missing panels, and sections replaced with makeshift aluminum. But to them, these wounds were sacred. They weren't just damage, they were history. The restoration began quietly in a hangar where time seemed to stand still. More than 100 people, most of them volunteers, dedicated themselves to resurrecting her. Every rivet was removed and replaced, every piece of metal stripped and repaired by hand. Many parts had to be fabricated from scratch, blueprints were incomplete, and certain components no longer existed. Craftsmen recreated them from fragments, using period tools whenever possible. Over 55,000 hours went into the restoration. 55,000 hours of devotion, precision, and love. As they worked, they discovered hundreds of names scratched into the aluminum, signatures left by decades of visitors who had wanted to touch history. Each name was documented before being polished away, preserved digitally as part of the plane's living memory. In time, the fortress regained her strength. Her nose art was repainted using wartime photographs as reference. Her cockpit was restored to full wartime configuration, every gauge and switch functional. Her engines gleamed once again. She was no longer just an artifact, she was alive. In March 2018, after 13 years of work, the Memphis Belle rolled out of the restoration hangar. 2 months later, on May 17th, she was unveiled to the public in the museum's World War II gallery, 75 years to the day since her 25th mission. Veterans wept openly. Families of the crew stood beneath her wings. Robert Morgan Jr., the pilot's son, was there to see her rebirth. His voice trembled as he spoke. My father always said she saved their lives more than once. He knew she'd be safe here. He'd be proud. For many, it felt like the completion of a circle, a warrior finally at rest, preserved in the exact moment of her greatest victory. William Wyler's wartime documentary, filmed in colour aboard the Belle, had become a timeless record of courage. The footage, rediscovered decades later, was restored frame by frame. In 2019, director Eric Nelson used Wyler's original reels to create The Cold Blue, a haunting documentary that brought the faces of those young airmen back to life in high definition. Their expressions, fear, focus, defiance, remain the most authentic window into what it meant to fly through the inferno of Europe's skies. Wyler himself had paid dearly for that footage. One of his cinematographers was killed, another wounded. But his film ensured that the Memphis Belle's story would never fade into myth. It preserved the truth, the cold, chaotic, beautiful truth of men who refused to die quietly. The crew's own stories stretched across decades. Captain Robert Morgan went on to command a B-29 named Dauntless Dottie in the Pacific, leading the first superfortress raid on Tokyo. He later wrote about his experiences, crediting discipline, teamwork, and divine luck for their survival. He passed away in 2004, knowing his beloved aircraft would be restored. Co-pilot James Varinis died a year earlier, remembered as both a pilot and a quiet counterbalance to Morgan's charisma. Others faded into civilian life. Mechanics, salesmen, fathers, grandfathers. Ordinary men carrying extraordinary memories. Some lived long enough to see the Belle restored. Others existed only in photographs, framed beside medals that gathered dust. Out of 350,000 airmen who served in the 8th Air Force, 26,000 never came home. More were captured or wounded. Statistically, bomber crewmen faced higher mortality rates than any other branch of the US military during the war. 1 in 4 would die before completing their tours. In that context, the Memphis Belle's survival was a miracle. She represented not just one crew, but all of them. The ones who vanished over Bremen, Schweinfurt, Regensburg. Every gleaming rivet in her fuselage carried the ghosts of the others who didn't make it back. When visitors walk through the museum today, they see her as she looked in May 1943. Olive drab paint, yellow mission symbols, the elegant script of her name beneath the pin-up on the nose. The interior smells faintly of oil and leather, the instruments frozen at 0. Her bomb bay doors hang open, as if waiting for the next sortie that will never come. To some, she is a machine. To others, she is a monument, a testament to youth, courage, and the brutal mathematics of survival. The Memphis Belle endures because she reminds us what it costs to win. Those 10 men were not superheroes. They were ordinary Americans, students, mechanics, sons of farmers and shopkeepers, who climbed into an aluminum box and flew straight into enemy fire again and again because it was their duty. They didn't expect fame. They didn't ask for recognition. They just wanted to come home. Against all logic, they did, and because of that, their story became legend. Today, the Memphis Belle rests not as a relic of destruction, but as a symbol of endurance. She is the heartbeat of the skies that once burned over Europe, a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the will to act in spite of it. Her rivets glint under the museum lights like stars, and somewhere, in that echoing hangar, the sound of her engines still hums faintly, the sound of 10 young men defying the odds, one mission at a time, flying home to history.